Hi, I wanted to talk to you about George Hysteria. Remember, we had a conversation about him the other day. He had received some insurance proceeds because of the fire that had damaged his residence. And as I recall, he received proceeds not only to, of course, fix the place that had the fire damage, but also to reimburse him for living expenses, food and lodging expenses during the time that he was displaced from his home. So you wanted me to look into whether those expenses were taxable to some extent. And so I did some research with the code. I wanted to share with you my findings, both in general and then in terms of his specific situation. So, as I recall, he lived in a hotel for about 6 months. He had received $36,000 in insurance expenses. And so I looked in the code, and fortunately, there is a section that speaks directly to George's situation. It's section 123, and I want to read to you from the code. It says, in the case of an individual whose principal residence is damaged or destroyed by fire, gross income does not include amounts received by such individual under an insurance contract, which are paid to compensate or reimburse such individual for living expenses incurred for himself and members of his household, resulting from the loss of use or occupancy of such residence. So, based on that, it would certainly seem like he has no taxable income from the proceeds. However, the section does go on to state that such amounts that are received will be excludable from gross income only to the extent that they exceed the difference between, first, and again I'll read from the code here, the actual living expenses incurred during such period for himself and members of his household, resulting from the loss of use or occupancy of their residence, and secondarily, the normal living expenses which would have been incurred for himself and members of his household during such period. So what this means is the insurance proceeds are, of course, intended to compensate him for extraordinary expenses that he's incurred. Staying in a hotel, eating every night at a restaurant instead of preparing food at home, which is invariably going to be more expensive. So at the end of the 6 month period, he needs to look at the expenses that he incurred because of the fire and compare those to expenses that he would have normally incurred, if any. So to do that type of analysis, we have to break down his expenses by category and think about the difference between what he would ordinarily pay and what he ended up paying because of the fire. So fortunately, if you look at the regulations, Treasury Regulation 1.123-1B4 gives an example, and the example is very much on point. It walks through an example of somebody who had fire damage like George and has various expenses. And so they set up a table. So I set up a table for George. And what's interesting to note about the table is that in the case where expenses were actually less than they would be ordinarily, we have to subtract those. So in the case of George, he had utilities. And he had $500 of utility expense incurred, but that was actually less than the $1,800 he would ordinarily incur. And because of the fact that he vacated his place, so a lot of the utilities were being used minimally during that time. So what I did was I put a table together very much like the one shown in Regulation 1.123B4. So the upshot for George is that in terms of housing expense, he had, of course, the $18,000 of hotel expense. So all of that would be something that the insurance proceeds would go toward. He had meals of $6,500. However, George would ordinarily pay $700 a month. So over 6 months, that's $4,200. And so the insurance proceeds are only intended to cover him for the extraordinary amount of his food expenses. So the extraordinary amount would be the $2,300 difference between $6,500 and $4,200. So if we add those two amounts together, $18,000 plus the $2,300, we're up to $20,300. However, as I said, he only incurred $500 of utilities expense versus $1,800 ordinarily. That negative $1,300 difference we will subtract from the sum. So the 20,300 less 1,300, we're down to a total of $19,000. So the bottom line is he had a net expense of $19,000 for food and living expenses because of the fire. Well, he received $36,000 from the insurance company. So of that $36,000, 19,000 of it did what the insurance proceeds were supposed to do, reimbursement. Well, what about the other 17,000? In that case, the other 17,000 does in fact count as gross income. Again, from section 123, it says it's excludable from gross income only to the extent that it meets those extraordinary expenses. And so the bottom line for George is that of those $36,000 of insurance proceeds, he will have $17,000 of gross income, and that is going to end up being taxable to him. So those are my findings. If you have any other questions, please let me know. Thank you.